Morning, everybody, and welcome. I guess it's afternoon now, 12:06, and thank you for coming and joining our Vital Signs Report launch for 2021. It's called Be the Change. Hope that when you see it, you'll feel part of the change and want to be part of the change. In welcoming you all, I want to acknowledge that we are on the territories gathered today on the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lane, Lenape, and Attawandaron people's territories. Vital Signs is an annual checkup on the state of our community, which I believe is representative of very, very many communities. It's part of a national program in partnership with Community Foundations of Canada and community foundations across the country. You'll probably, some of you will have seen Community Foundations launching their Vital Signs report in the last 2 weeks. It used to be we launched on one day, but they're staggered, but it's usually a week and a half window. Vital Signs examines issues that are significant to the well-being and quality of life. By creating awareness of these issues, we can connect philanthropy to the needs of the community and set priorities and identify opportunities for action. We are thrilled to welcome our incredible panel here today, as well as our moderator, Dr. Jerry White. I've referred to Jerry as the moderator God, because he does such a good job. Jerry is a London Community Foundation board member, the chair of our Vital Signs Committee and the Social Finance Committee. He's a board member at Namarin Friendship Center and is the recipient of a Natlosa Peace Award. Jerry is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Western, Director of the Aboriginal Policy Research Consortium internationally, and founder and Emeritus Editor-in-Chief of the International Indigenous Policy Journal, among other things. He's a wonderful friend of London Community Foundation, so welcome, Dr. Jerry White.
Thanks so much, Martha. And thanks everybody for your time and your interest today. And thanks in advance to the expert panel that we have. I'm so looking forward to hearing advice from you after I give a brief introduction. We at the Community Foundation are really pleased to announce the release of Vital Signs 2021. It's entitled Be the Change. Last year, Vital Signs 2020, our aim was to expose the problems that's faced by so many people in the city and the county, and also talk about why those problems impact all of us, and we have to look at them that way. We said, for example, that poverty was a serious problem, with over 18% of Londoners, 18% living in measurable poverty. And some of the communities are even hit much harder, more dire circumstances. Our Indigenous neighbors at 36%, and newcomers, those people we looked at who have come to London since 2010, they were sitting at just under 50% poverty. We talked about housing in last year's report because there was 5,000 people sitting on a list waiting for income geared to rent geared to income housing. And we identified that over 13% of Londoners face core housing need, which means they have either woefully inadequate space for the number of people that are living in the housing, and or it needs major repairs, and or they're paying much too much of the income that they make to just have a roof over their heads. This situation is magnified for other populations in the city, Indigenous peoples at 26%, newcomers nearly 40%. We identified problems in education, post-secondary completion, and that's a basic stepping stone to a good future so that their sons and daughters and their grandchildren would be able to have good and better lives. We looked at hunger, we looked at racism, we looked at gender violence, and we also looked at equality. So there we were, coming off of part 1, 2020, Vital Signs, and we said to ourselves, we should be looking to see, have things changed? And the unfortunate thing we'd say is that things did change. They got worse. The pandemic operated sort of like pulling or ripping the lid off something. It acted as if a fan to make the fires grow hotter. It exacerbated many of the community's really deeply entrenched inequalities. This year's report looks at 6 major areas: housing, racial equity, gender equality, health and well-being, food security, and education. These didn't drop from the sky, and we didn't just decide. We've been working through our granting programs and our social impact loaning programs. We've identified patterns in what people are bringing forward and what problems they see in the city. And we set up the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Council with other foundations, our partner foundations, Westminster and Lawson. And we set that up and we distributed more than $2 million to organizations that were working on the ground to deliver services. The patterns that we saw in these deliveries of services from people, where things were needed, what was going on in housing, food, and others, led us to identify these 6 areas to carry forward. We approach our work, we use the lens of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals were put together to try and build a better world for all of us to live in. Not all of them apply directly to London. So we've localized those, and we work with people like SDG Cities and other organizations to get people to use them, organizations, people who are doing the work on the ground to try and improve our city and our region, to get them to take up a kind of a measuring tool that will help them, because we want to someday maybe be talking all the same language where we can cooperate and do joint research and share our understandings and be even more effective in making the kind of social change that's necessary. I said that things got worse. If we take housing, I'm just going to take a couple of examples from our report, but if we take housing, for example, another 1,000 families are on that 5,000 person list. We're up to 6 now that are looking for affordable housing. Surveys we put forward, like the one from Lifespin that found 77% of the 300 low-income tenants they polled had major repairs needed to their housing. COVID really exposed some problems in the food chain and in our local food system. Our community had to work very hard to build new and effective solutions. In 2021, London Food Bank and some of its partners, for example, Salvation Army, Daily Bread, YFC, assisted almost 12,000 families who were in dire need of food, who faced food insecurity. Last month alone, our measurements show that 3,000 families received food hampers through the food bank. And this past 6 months, Glenn Pearson at the food bank tells us that their clients increased by 21% just in the past 6 months. Indigenous organizations like Namrand and Atlosa reached out to their communities and helped hundreds of families. Local neighborhoods helped thousands more with food passed through the bank. We should be proud to say that 9 new regional food distribution depots for low-income families were set up, 4 YMCAs and 5 community resource centers. This is unbelievable. This is an example of being the change as we put forward, but it doesn't address the underlying causes of food insecurity, just the same way as helping people on a basic level doesn't solve any of those other issues. It's been from a sad point of view, a very, very bad time for increasing racism and discrimination. Vital Signs points out that hate crimes in London and Middlesex County have risen nearly 50% in the past year. 6 out of 10 of our Indigenous citizens report being on the receiving end of racist treatment and remarks. Our community has witnessed, and this was an incredible thing, witnessed what racism looks like at its very, very worst. When in June of 2021, a terrorist attack killed 4 members of the Afzal family in London. It was a horrible thing. And we saw people rise up and say they would not put up with this. They didn't like it. They didn't want it. They supported, but it happened here. Across Canada, Indigenous communities continue to face immense impact of historical and ongoing injustice with the discovery of thousands of unmarked graves, which are added to the staggering 4,100 children we knew had already died in those residential schools. Other attacks on Indigenous communities are taking place as well. Access to clean drinking water is a critical issue. Our neighbors, the Oneida of the Thames, have been under a long-term advisory for a very long term, and there's no sign in sight. I have gone through the research myself. They do not have a plan. Chippewa-on-the-Thames First Nation, we heard from Ray Deliri not long ago in one of our podcasts, but they've been just recently under a boil water advisory. We saw COVID hit diverse communities and communities that were poorer or had lower income levels much harder. Some of the research that we saw indicates that diverse communities have more than 5 times the number of positive COVID tests. In terms of gender equality, in our report this year, we point out that across London and Middlesex County, service providers are not only reporting an increase in intimate partner violence, but an increase in the severity of those cases. Anova, a friend of LCF, reported that the number of contact points through their research support program more than doubled, 117% increase. And they also saw that the length of time people were staying in their facilities, there was a 44% increase in that length of shelter stays. Similarly, London Abused Women's Centre reported a 45% increase in their urgent care services. So Vital Signs paints a fairly serious picture of what's going on in our city, in our region, what we're facing. However, this report is not just that. It's really different from that. This report sets a new direction. It calls for actions. It says, do not say what's wrong. Let's do something about what's wrong. It makes calls to action, and it provides people with some tools to engage in making social change. Friends, this report is not numbers. It's a call to move. Move on homelessness and housing instability, on racism and discrimination, on gender-based discrimination, funding education and handling education in a way that everybody is prized and every child feels their culture, their language, their clothing, who they are is prized in that system, and they have accessible education, and to build a responsive and useful food delivery system. To help people take action, we've announced that we've launched the London Vital Signs Data Hub. So organizations can seek information and they can post information. And they can use that will help develop strategies that can lead to influencing public policy. We also have lists of organizations. You can go online if you're deeply interested in gender equality and you want to know what organizations are working on these questions in this city. One click takes you to that organization and they can tell you, can you join? How can you support? What can you do? So we want to create pathways for people to take action and organizations to take action. Now, I wanted to say that this is a work in progress, so we apologize to those we have left off our lists. Please contact us, we will rectify that. We have enlisted community experts and activists, like the 3 people we have today, and thank you very much again, to do blogs and podcasts that will inform people of what can and should be supported and what can be done. Indigenous leaders, Black leaders, health experts, housing activists, women's equity and protection experts, all giving guidance. Not, oh, things are bad, but yes, things are bad. Here's what you can do. Here's where you can go. Here's how you can work on this. As one of my friends said, I was talking to her not long ago, she was facing some Indigenous issues with her Indigenous family. And she said, Jerry, it's time for truth and reconciliation. And what that means to me, and what my friend was saying to me, is we have to move on these things. It's time to do something. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce 3 community experts. These are people who have dedicated much of their adult lives to making change and improving policies, helping organizations grow and do the right thing, improving the way cities and organizations and governments approach problems. They have a triple wealth of background and understanding. Nawaz Tahir is a litigation lawyer and managing partner of the Kig Borlaug's London office. He was born and raised in London, and he currently serves on the board of the YMCA of Southwestern Ontario, is the vice chair of the board of St. Joe's Healthcare, and he is the chair of the Hikma Public Affairs Council, which is an advisory group, an advocacy group for local London area Muslims. People who work with them have things to say about you. And what do they call you? They say you're a leader, they tell me you're a negotiator, and they tell me you're a relentless advocate. And you told me that when you're not advocating for social change, you're an avid Green Bay Packers and Toronto Raptors fan. Welcome, Nawaz. Mike Moffat is an assistant professor in the Business, Economics, and Public Policy group at Ivey Business School. He is the Senior Director, Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute. In 2017, Mike was the Chief Innovation Fellow for the Government of Canada, and he has played the role of advising deputy ministers on innovation policy in our country. He represented Canada at G7, OECD, and Organization of American States meetings. He was Director of Policy and Research for Canada 2020. He was the interim director of the Lawrence National Center for Policy and Management. And if the list wasn't long enough, he was also chief economist for the Mowat Center at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for coming. Mojdeh Cox is the executive director of Pillar Nonprofit Network. Mojdeh believes in the power of the collective compassion, creativity, and action to work towards solutions to complex social problems. She has spent more than a decade, actually much more than a decade, working in co-visioning and co-designing and executing political and issue-based advocacy campaigns. Her extensive social policy work is recognized by those around her for the skills that she brings in community-based leadership roles designed to bring people together. This is a common theme about what people talk about Mojdeh. For over a decade, Mojdeh has coached organizational and community leaders, businesses, not-for-profit organizations, and the list could go on for a long time. Her aim has been to get them to reimagine their work through a heightened equity lens that's rooted in social justice. I asked people, what do you call her? And they said, tenacious and gracious. Welcome, Mojdeh. Okay. Okay, you've, my panel, thank you so very much. You've read our report. You've heard my not too brief comments. I apologize for taking so many minutes. So now I want to turn the floor over to you. And I want to start with Mojdeh, and then I'll move people around. Normally I'll direct the question to one of our panelists and then ask the other two to comment on the same question. Mojdeh, where should we as Londoners and helping organizations start with addressing the problems that we face? How can we make the changes that are really necessary? The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction and the warm welcome. It's great to see all of these amazing community members join us today. The overview was so necessary, Jerry, in setting up this conversation, so I do greatly appreciate it. This is an excellent question. You know, there's a great need for us to rethink accountability in these times. Accountability is one of the 7 elements to building what is necessary to building trust. And so if we really want to move the needle and move the dial on where we are right now around equity issues and lifting our community up where they need to be, we must root our actions in accountability. So similarly, I think we need to understand the anatomy of radical accountability. But let me first define what I mean by that really quickly for you. When I was a young activist, I used to be called a radical. So it's interesting that now it's transitioned as I age into gracious and tenacious. It used to be, she's radical. And, you know, at the time, depending on who you are and your proximity to power and other things, you may be curious about whether radical is a good thing or a bad thing. At the time, I took that as a compliment because I reverted back as a direction to a wonderful professor at Fanshawe that really identified the real definition of the term radical. And it means affecting the fundamental nature of something or getting to the root. So I said, if that's what I'm doing, right on, keep calling me radical. And so then moving to accountability, the act of being responsible for something and being able to justify your rationale on the how behind your one's accountability measures is what we are really talking about when we're talking about radical accountability. So to be radically accountable is to take ownership of our thoughts, our behaviors, and our impact while building authentic relationships in our communities based on trust and compassion. And so where do we need to go as a community is to root our actions in radical accountability. And that doesn't look like this. It actually looks a lot like this. And the anatomy of radical accountability is brutal honesty, in my opinion. But who am I? Just a radical gal. One of the elements is brutal honesty, setting your intention, but not just setting it, but declaring it so that you are able to articulate that with those you're working with. You're not moving alone. Self-reflection, positioning yourself, rooting yourself into the problem. Because if we avoid the idea and the conversation that we are a part of the problem, we may never solve these questions in our communities. And then we have to take the final step, which is action through changed behavior. If we walk away from navigating the anatomy of radical accountability, saying, I don't need to do anything differently, we're likely doing radical accountability wrong. And so where do we need to go as a community? I think we need to root ourselves into what it is that we actually need to do. We need to build trust. If London is amongst one of the most unsafe cities in the entire country, which has been listed, you know, London is on that list. I was reluctant to move back. If it wasn't for my deep hope that we can move the needle and that I don't have to fear for the safety of my own children, I wouldn't have returned into a city that I left 5 years ago. So if we're really talking about moving the needle and folks understanding we need to get real about who London is in the context of safety and the most vulnerable people, not in who we want to be. I think that's a future visioning piece that we need to capture. But really building trust means getting real about who we are, getting real about the stories we tell about ourselves, and getting real about accountability. And that starts with us. Systems are not operating inadvertently. When we talk about systemic discrimination, systemic racism, systemic issues, people drive those systems. We are the people.
Thank you very much. Mike, can I just move that right over into your desk?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a tough act to follow, but yeah, I am blown away by this report because I think it strikes a balance that I think is really hard. That it does have that brutal honesty. It does not sugarcoat the issues, the very real issues that London and other communities across Ontario and across the world are having. But at the same time, doesn't lead to sort of that despair or that, oh no, we can't do anything about this. This is just too large. So, I kudos to the team for doing that and striking that balance. And I do think it is going to take all of us, that whether it be whether it be on housing, on gender equity, or the other issues mentioned. And some of the ones that weren't mentioned, like climate change, that we all have a role to play. So I appreciate the hard work that's been done here, and there's a lot of work to do, but you've left the door open and created that sort of optimism that we can actually make things build back better, as we keep hearing from the US.
Thanks, Mike. Nawaz, where do we start?
Well, thank you, Jay. First of all, thank you for the kind words and kind introduction. Thank you, Martha, for all of your leadership on this, and really everybody at the London Community Foundation for the work that goes into this, and for having me take part in this. And to everybody that's on the call today, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to be with us this afternoon. I really believe that the nonprofit sector is leading the charge here, and we can look to the nonprofit sector for leadership in this regard. I thought I saw Sister Joan Atkinson on the call as well, and as a Muslim, and having been exposed to St. Joseph's and all of the things that are happening there, just really being inspired by the Sisters of St. Joseph and how they just got to work. They saw a social problem, they rolled up their sleeves, they got to work. And I think in London, that spirit really and truly exists. We've got a number of social service agencies that are doing innovative things. They're on the ground. They're really trying to get to the root cause, as you said, Jerry, of the problems. And so I think we're sort of talking about and building on the accountability piece that Mojdeh talked about. We're sort of seeing that the government isn't as nimble and innovative enough, and sometimes we need to rely on the nonprofit sector. So I really think that we need to make sure that we have a strong, sustainable nonprofit sector. So in terms of where do we help? Supporting these wonderful organizations that are doing so much in our community, whether it's through donations, whether it's through governance support, whether it's through volunteering, or just the ideas. I really believe the nonprofit sector has that ability to be nimble with ideas, to innovate and look at things that can be done in the community on a relatively quick basis. So it's really that grassroots approach. And the fact of the matter is, I really believe in London. We have incredible brain power in this city. And so we need to use the nonprofit sector. And I think the nonprofit sector is that way that we can really harness that incredible brain power that we've got in our city.
Thanks very much. And I guess the next thing I want to ask the panel is, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? Was there anything that stood out for you on either of those sides? And maybe, could I ask Nawaz, why don't you start and I'll go the other route back.
Sure. Thank you. I guess I would sort of say, unfortunately, yes, you got it right, in the sense that it's unfortunate that things seem to be getting worse when you look at a number of different factors. I look at the hate crime statistic from the London Police, 50% increase. And I know anecdotally that hate crimes are still underreported. There's still a sea of unreported hate crimes because a lot of people that are subjected to those hate crimes just don't feel like the system is going to be there for them and help support them. So we really need to focus on those support systems as well. The issue of homelessness and affordable housing is getting worse. And so we really need to address that. And there's so many other things that were listed in the report that we need to pay attention to. But the one thing for me that jumped out at me about the report, and really the key for me, is how do we act? And so the call to action is really important. Be the change London, and that whole notion of where do we go and how do we act? And I, kudos to you and the team for the data hub, the action points that are located throughout the report to give people an opportunity to channel that energy. I think the numbers that we see on the call today are an example of that energy, and being able to provide an outlet for that energy, I think, is really important. So I congratulate you on that piece, the data hub, the links to organizations in the community, and the tools that are located throughout the report.
No, thank you very much. And it's just wanted to clarify, it's the team that should get the pat on the back for sure. Mike, what did we get right? What did we get wrong?
Yeah, so I particularly enjoyed the focus on housing, right? That if people don't have sort of an affordable, an attainable place to live, that makes so many other, from mental health to all of these other issues so much worse. So I think it has to begin at housing, and I appreciate the emphasis on that. One thing, and I don't want to be, this isn't intended to be critical of the panel, but this is more so, I think, a bigger societal issue, is that I think during COVID, all of our focus has gotten very short term because we have so many short term problems, from housing to racism to so on. It really exposed some of the sort of worst issues of our society. And again, the report has done a great job of picking up on that. But we cannot lose sight of some of these longer term issues. I'm going to focus on climate change, but there are other ones as well. And I think we need to make sure that we have a longer term focus, and we balance our time of focusing on things that we can address in the next 3 to 6 to 9 months, and things that are more of a generational challenge. So, and with climate change, that's going to hit home. We saw just a few weeks ago, I don't know, time has been kind of compressed during the pandemic, but the flooding issues that we've had here in London, those are only going to get worse with climate change. As the climate heats up, we're going to get more precipitation coming off the Great Lakes. That's going to require us to make some pretty big changes to both how much CO2 we're putting in the air, but also how do we adapt to those changes. We're seeing wildfires across the West. We're seeing issues across the world. That is going to create a set of climate refugees. And many of which will settle in southwestern Ontario because they're looking for places with fresh water and reasonable climate, good economies and good places to raise a family. We've got all of that here, and we need to sort of plan for that, because all of those issues that we talk about in the report, and you sort of rightly point out in the report, from housing, housing to racism, to sort of pointing fingers at others. As more climate refugees settle in this area, all of those issues are going to be amplified. So again, that would be the one thing I would say to this group and other groups as well, that yes, the pandemic is important. It has shown some of the real stresses in our issues, but we need to also balance short-term concerns with long-term concerns.
Thanks a lot. Mojdeh, I'm passing it to you.
Thank you. I have to echo my fellow panelists with the recommendations and the overall analysis of the report. My reflection says I look for intersectional data and analysis, and that was present in the report. I look for exploring topics that are difficult to gather data on, and the Vital Signs report did not shy away from talking about the deep impact of hate, how racialized populations and Indigenous populations are impacted in these times. It's hard to collect data on that, and you went for the issues despite that challenge. The report has given us something to really work with through prompting action. And so I really admire that about the report as well. So now it's up to us. We often see insightful reports. We don't often see recommendations and a starting point. So that's something that I have to say is something that Pillar Nonprofit Network is really looking forward to tapping into. One of the things that I can say can be a part of the actions that we can take. So it's not necessarily a critique, but an idea to add on to the report, and perhaps a call to action to all of these wonderful community members and leaders in their own right. To Mike's point, Mr. Moffat pointed to the fact that we have to think about the future state and not just immediate reactions, although that's also necessary at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other for sure. Pointing to climate change, pointing to some of the things that we're actually doing in this moment that's going to impact the future. How dare we do that without the voice of youth who are going to live through the decisions that we are making today? So each and every day I walk into my workplace and I get all emotional thinking about this, so I'm going to try to collect myself. I think about my 4 children and my firstborn, who's 19, second-year student at King's. So props to any King's folks on this call. The decisions and the work that Pillar Nonprofit Network does today, and all of the collaboration that is happening in the community that we're a part of, or that we convene, or that I witness, we're doing so, and in many cases, not consulting the youth that are going to live through our decisions. And when we're doing so without rooting in a very intentional way, radical accountability in our actions, what we're doing is we're making these decisions without, really in hindsight, looking at who's going to live through the implications of our decisions. I can tell you right now, I'm not perfect. I may be tenacious, I may be radical, but I'm not, and I am going to make some mistakes. Pillar Nonprofit Network is not a perfect organization, and we have certainly made mistakes, and we'll continue to do so and learn through those pressure points. I think what we have to do is measure to what extent are we willing to make mistakes without consulting the very people that are going to live through the implications of our decisions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to pose a question that's more specific to the background that you folks have been working on, particularly. Maybe I'll start with Mike. You were recently on TVO discussing housing availability and a host of related issues, and you raised housing just now as a key issue along with climate change. Can I ask you to speak to what specifically needs to be done in terms of housing? How can citizens and organizations help push for policy changes that you see as necessary? What are maybe some of those policy changes?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a study at SPI trying to sort of figure out what's going on in the housing market and what does the future hold. So what we found is that over the next 10 years in Ontario, given projections of population growth, immigration targets, international student targets, and so on, the population of Ontario is slated to grow by about 2.3 million people. And if you take the ages and demographics into account, we're going to have about 920,000 net new families being formed across Ontario. If we couple that with the existing housing shortage, we're basically going to need 1 million new homes of all types over the next 10 years. And I think it's important that those, as much as possible, get built in cities. We're already losing 175 acres of farmland every day to development. We're losing wetlands that we need for flood control and other important areas. So, that's sort of illustrative of the problem. I think what we need to do as organizations, as individuals, is get together and go, okay, this is what the problem is. How can we get more climate friendly, family friendly, affordable housing in our cities? How can we basically get to, yes, we've got so many barriers to building these, whether they be financial barriers or zoning barriers or things like that. How can we as a community say, okay, no, this is really important to us. We know it's going to require some changes, and it's going to require some inconvenience. I know nobody likes having construction in their backyard, but how can we push our policymakers to accelerate this, and listen to the concerns of the community, but try and address those concerns rather than simply saying, okay, no, we're not going to build this social housing here because it's too inconvenient. So we've been trying at SPI as much as possible, again, for that stage one of sort of admitting we have an issue that we need to deal with. And now I think it's up to all of us to try and work together with all levels of government, get everybody in a room saying, okay, we know there is housing shortages. How can we get housing built in our cities along transit lines that's, again, climate friendly, family friendly, and affordable?
Thank you. Just a note in terms of LCF on that too, Michael, is that we're part of the consortium that's developing the Soho lands, and we're looking at over 600 units, a large proportion of them to be affordable, and of course central and on transit. So I think it's good to hear that that is some what we should be pushing for. Mojdeh, you chair the Pillar Nonprofit Network. How can we get nonprofits to work together for change? Where are the problems now? And how can we solve them? This is a real curveball coming across the plate, I know. And how can we engage the communities that we work with? And there's all different, right? Many of our partners and friends and have different communities they work with. How do we engage those communities so we can bring them together to be able to be effective?
It was a curveball, but I, got my bat ready to swing. These are really great questions. With respect to the nonprofit sector, we know a lot of things about the nonprofit sector through the leadership of amazing organizations like Imagine Canada. The Ontario Nonprofit Network provides us with data, tools, resources, and opportunities to convene. Locally, Pillar Nonprofit Network is trying to fill that and has been trying to fill that space for local nonprofits. Some of the things that we can actually do to get ourselves aligned with one another first is to get strategic and get molecular about the kind of change we want to see. Pulling from this report and the recommendations, calls to action, getting real, like put a pin on exactly what it is that we want to do, and that's a part of that setting the intention. So. I haven't figured it out. I'm going to get a little redundant around the anatomy of radical accountability because I'm really serious about that. I think that is the roadmap to how we get this work done together. I mean, we can certainly do it independently without that self-reflection and have opportunities to pat ourselves on the back and make bold statements that don't actually have real impact on the people that we're trying to help. So we have to get real molecular. What are we trying to achieve and to what end? I think that's first. Clarity on the path forward and what we're trying to reach, who we're trying to, what are we trying to accomplish together? That's number one. And then getting strategic about it. What are the tactics that we can deploy as a sector? Where are our strengths? Let's lean on our strengths and areas of opportunity. So let's not tap folks who don't have the capacity to do this one thing. Let's see what they're good at. That's their role in all of this. And guess what I'm actually spelling out here is like fundamental, foundational organizing tactics. Who's good at what? Who's at the table? Who's good at what? Let's do what we're good at. And let's also offer opportunities to learn and grow with one another, learn and evolve rather. I have to say that one of the things that the sector gets right is the need to move together. One of the things that the sector gets right, the impact sector and nonprofits is doing right, is moving through the motions, resilience, tapping into our own internal energy and building capacity around difficult issues, complex issues that we're trying to solve. One thing we're not excellent at, and I've said this a couple of times, so if I've lost any friends, y'all haven't called me for a little while, so I know who you are. No, I'm just kidding. It is about that radical accountability piece. What are the stories that we're telling ourselves about ourselves? Start to tell the stories about ourselves that we know the most vulnerable are creating that narrative about us. And then look to those that are not presently at the table with us working through these complex issues. If we don't have youth, we're not doing this right. If we do not have an intersectional, representative, not tokenistic, representative perspectives at the tables when we're making decisions, we're not getting it right. If we're not utilizing our capabilities in the best way, in the most efficient way, based on our capacity and needs, we're not getting it right. we're putting additional pressure on one another that isn't necessarily a part of movement building. What is a part of movement building is bringing people together, deploying traditional fundamental organizing tactics of how do we build on this thing that we already have established, and keep people there, retention, keeping people at the table, keeping the interest. It really involves leveraging everyone's skills and resources. So I think there's opportunity. We're getting a lot right. There's a lot of space for us to learn and evolve.
We certainly had to learn that in the COVID-19 when we started to divide out which organizations should be delivering what kind of services and rationalizing. So I've seen that. Nawaz, given your knowledge and the challenges that face the diverse Muslim community, and I want to put a real emphasis on diverse, because the Muslim community is many languages, many cultures, it's not one. What should we be doing? How do we support and work for policy and action change?
Thanks, Jerry. So, as you said, it's a diverse community that comes from really all four corners of the earth, and I say that because it's important to understand in that context that Canada, and I still very much believe this, is a beacon of hope, a land of opportunity that people still see from around the globe. But we have work to do. It's 2021, and we can't say that everyone has an equal chance at that opportunity. We look at some of our Indigenous brothers and sisters who don't have clean drinking water in 2021. Muslim women across the country are still being harassed and in some cases outright assaulted because they wear the hijab. We have mosques across the country that are still being vandalized and attacked. And so on the other side, I remember June 8th. I remember the vigil. I remember looking out at a huge sea of people who were there because they cared. I remember the following Friday vividly walking with at least 10,000 other people as part of the multi-faith walk. So I know that there are a lot of people that care. I know that there are a lot of people that want to help. And I talked earlier about the nonprofit sector, but similar to what Mojdeh said, we need to hold our elected officials accountable. It's been over 120 days now since the Afzal family was stolen from us, and we had an Islamophobia summit, but we've also had an election, and it feels like with that election that it's been much longer, and so we can't forget about what happened before the election. We can't forget about the recommendations that were made. Hikma in London made 20 plus recommendations. NCCM nationally made over 60 recommendations to all levels of government on how we can fight hate. And so we need to go back to our elected officials and say, what's happening? What are you doing on moving the needle? What are you doing in respect of these recommendations? And the way really to fight hate is to fight that ignorance that is underneath the hate. And so we need our elected officials to really lead in that front. So, when I think about that sea of people at the vigil, when I think about that sea of people on the walk, if all of those people were to go to our elected officials and say, hey, we really care, as we showed in attending the vigil and walking in the interfaith walk, show us what our elected officials are doing. I think that's a really, really important step, because we really need to move on this, as with some of the other things that are in the report, because it's really important. That there are a lot of people in our society that need our help as we sort of move to the finish line. some that were running beside us have fallen. And what really is magical about our country that I really believe in is it's in our nature not to analyze why that person necessarily fell or whose fault it was, but to extend our hand and help lift them up and get them back in line towards that finish line as well with us. And so that's really the emphasis that we need to think about and keep on our minds.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to spoil the blogs and podcasts that are going to come out with this too. You'll have a chance to read them, but one of our commentators said it's time to move from being non-racist to being anti-racist. And it's time to understand that our liberation, me, Irish background, my liberation is really dependent on the liberation of Indigenous people as well. So those are some of the kinds of things that I think you'll find in the report. I want to thank our panelists for their amazing insights and all our guests. I'm going to let Martha finish off, but I was just thinking myself, wouldn't it be nice if the title of our 2031 vital signs was See the Change instead of Be the Change? And we could talk about in there of how we want to thank all the people for pulling their part and being part of that change. So that's sort of the goal we've set for ourselves. 10 years. Let's see if we can do that. Martha, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Jerry. I love your wrap up, See the Change. And I think that's part of the call to action here, is so we can measure the change. This has been amazing. I've taken notes. It's ringing. Some of the things that I have really taken away, someone just comments, Mike, you referred to climate refugees, and I look at, your analysis there, and I look at the issue areas that we've identified in this report and think those are just going to be exacerbated if we don't do something. I apologize about that. I just threw the phone out the room, out of the room. They will be exacerbated. And Mojdeh, with your comment about how can we ignore our youth, I have little grandchildren, and I think of what are we leaving them? And if we are, our world is changing, our city is changing, our community is changing, communities, plural, what are we leaving our youth if we don't do something now about it? So, and I love the comment about getting molecular, focusing charities into and actions, call to actions, and at a molecular level to grow from there. Jerry, thank you. You, as usual, did an amazing job today. Wonderful insights from our panel. Jerry, your insights were just monumental, and I just so love when I get to hear from you. Vanessa and your team for all your work in putting this together. And everybody's input into the data. It's been amazing. So thank you all for joining us and being part of Be the Change, because I believe that when I look through the list of who's on here, there's a lot of people here who do care and really want to be part of this change. So I thank you all, and I encourage you to go to the full report at the website, which is BeTheChangeLondon.ca. And I hope you have a wonderful day and stay safe and in kindness. Miigwech.
Thank you so much to our panelists. And I'm sorry we couldn't give you 3 hours, because we would have learned 3 times as much.